Hi, my name's Stewart Lynch, and in this video I'm going to introduce you to the grid view for SwiftUI that was introduced in iOS 16. We'll take a look at 3 different examples exploring all of the grid building blocks, including the grid container itself and the grid row, and we'll also inspect how we can manage our grid using grid alignments. We'll control positioning with cell alignments and anchors, as well as full column alignments. And we'll also be looking at merging cells using column spans. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. As usual, I have a starter project for this tutorial that you can download from the link in the description below. I encourage you to work along because after that you'll have a nice project to use as a reference in the future when you want to implement grids in your own projects. You'll need to be using Xcode 14 or later, and as you can see I'm using Beta 5 at the time of this tutorial. I've added a number of assets and support files that you really do not need to worry about as they do not affect your code. The assets are images of the example grids that we'll be creating. And I have 2 tabs for our 3 examples. You can see on this first tab that there are placeholders where I want to create the grid. The sheet is triggered by the assignment of a sample image enum, which in turn presents a bottom sheet displaying the image that we are about to create. And the second tab only has a single example. Now, in preparation for this video, I read a lot of blog posts, and I came across 3 that you should check out too. The first is by Sarun, and he always writes nice, complete blog posts on topics. The second is Mastering the Grid Layout in SwiftUI by Majid, and I'm always impressed by the attention to detail that he puts into his framework explorations. And the final one is the Eager Grids with SwiftUI by Javier. Javier is the developer of the companion for SwiftUI app that's available from the App Store, and it should be in all iOS devs' toolboxes. This is a very thorough investigation of grids and also provides you with access to a grid trainer app that you can use to explore the modifications of different grid settings. Links to these are in the notes below. Now, a grid is a container that contains a number of rows, and each row can have a varying number of columns or cells. It's not required that every row have the same number of cells. Each cell is a view, and views are either pushing or pulling views. For example, let's create a grid that consists of 2 rows. Replace the comment in the first example with a grid container view. And then inside there is where we create our grid rows using the grid row container. Now each row can have 1 or more cells. So in our example, each row's cell will be a rectangle with no frame restrictions. Now a rectangle is a shape that, unless restricted, it will take up as much space as it can get. So as you can see, I have but 1 rectangle. It's the single grid row with a single rectangle cell that takes up the entire space available. And because we're in a scroll view, that's just this horizontal space between my 2 titles. If I comment out the scroll view, we see that it'll expand vertically as well. Let me add 2 more identical cells. That available space now is divided up evenly across the row. Now if I duplicate the row, and remove the last cell, even though you'd think that these 2 cells would expand to take up the entire horizontal and vertical space left, they don't, because cells are members of a column and they are matched by the order in the grid row. If there are fewer cells in one of the rows, the remaining cells are just empty. Let's replace that last rectangle in the first row with a text view using the string hello. Now, since text views only take up as much space as needed to provide for the text, this column is much narrower and the remaining rectangle columns expand to fill the gap. If we reverse the text view so that it's in the center, something interesting happens. The text view is centered within the cell and the cell is now the same width as the corresponding cell in the second row. If a cell's width or height frame is not specified, the width will be the width of the column with the widest view. So in our case, that's the rectangle in the second row. A similar thing would be the case if we altered the height of a cell. The row would be as high as the higher cell in that row. Let's revert back now to undo everything, and we'll go back to the beginning and start to create our set examples. Well, now that we have an overview of how grids function, let's explore a few examples. The title for this example is Cell Alignments and Spans. And if you tap on the Image button beside the title, you'll see what I want to create. Now, I've created a sample view that I call Square that allows me to provide a width, and it will create a rectangle view that has the width and height specifications, unlike what we've seen here already. So let me create a grid, and inside I'm going to create 2 grid rows, each with 3 square cells having a width of 50. Let me compare that to the preview. My preview has 3 cells and 2 rows, but the size of the first cell appears to be twice the size of the other cells, and the alignment of the remaining cells in the first row are quite different. Similarly, in the second row, it looks like there are 4 columns with a gap in between. But how can that be possible without creating a view that might be a clear-colored square? And we're not doing that. How many cells are there really here? Well, let's investigate that. First, let me change the size of our first square to be 100. It's now wider, so the corresponding cell in the next row is centered on it. Well, what I can do is for that top first cell is span it over 2 columns by applying a Grid Cell Columns modifier and specify 2. This effectively adds an extra column to our row, and as a result, our first row now has 4 columns. And the second row only has 3. And that's why the third square in the second row moves to the left as there is no 4th column. Now this is looking pretty good, except that it's a little narrow. And that's because by default, there is a horizontal and vertical spacing between rows and columns with a default of 10. And I can verify that if I apply the horizontal spacing and vertical spacings to the grid itself and assign them a value of 0. Now this is not what I want, of course, so let me remove that. Instead, let's just change the width of our square to be 110. That's what we want. Now you may have noticed that the grid has an alignment property, and we'll look at that in the next example. But we want to change the alignment of cells in a particular row, and we want the second square to be at the top and the third one to be at the bottom. If we apply the alignment to our grid row, it'll apply it to both. And let's see that. We'll set the alignment to top. We still want the second one to be at the bottom in relation to our first cell. So we can override that top alignment with what is called a cell anchor. And there are a number of different choices for grid cell anchor, and the one that we want is bottom. Now this is almost what we want to match our example, but that third square needs to be moved over. Remember, we figured out that their first row now has 4 columns, so what we can do is specify that that last square can span 2 columns using the Grid Cell Columns modifier. This uses the default alignment of center, so it's now centered between columns 3 and 4. But we can apply a cell anchor on this cell to move it to the trailing edge. It's looking pretty good, but you may not have noticed that there is a divider running the length of the grid as an additional kind of row. within the grid itself, we want to add a divider. So let's do that. The problem is that it expands now to be the full length of the screen, pushing it out because a divider pushes things. It's a push view, and it messes up our grid. So why don't we embed it in a grid row? But that means there's only one cell, and it only goes the width of that first cell. So why don't we span it over 4 columns using the grid cell columns? Well, now it expands the full length of the view again. That's not good. And the solution is to add a modifier that applies unsized axes in the horizontal direction. And that's the grid cell unsized axes that requires a set. And what we want in our set is just horizontal. Now, to see this a little bit better on the screen, I'm going to replace the divider with a rectangle using a frame height of 1. Essentially, that's the same as a divider. Now, we can do even better of this, however. And it turns out that you don't even need the grid row or the column spans for either the divider or the rectangle. We can remove the grid row and the column span completely, and we end up with just a line spanning the width of our grid. Let's set it back to the divider to match our example. And there you have it. We have a match for our diagram. In our next example, we're not going to do any column spans. So it looks like we have 4 rows and 4 columns. However, the width of one of the squares in each of the rows is doubled. And let's not worry about the alignment for now, just the sizing. So let's start out by creating a grid. And we'll start with a grid row with squares with a width of 50. And we'll have 4 of those in each grid row. And we'll duplicate it so that we now have 4 grid rows, each with 4 square cells. If I check the diagram then, you can see that we want to double the first in the first row, the second in the second, the third in the third, and then in the fourth row we go back and double that first cell. So let's go back and do that. Well, the sizing is right, but the alignment of our cells within each row is way off. So let's start with horizontal assignment of our cells. And I can do that globally on all cells by setting the alignment on the grid itself to be a leading alignment. Now my first and fourth columns look good. And 2 of the 3 in the second column are okay, but the third column is completely wrong for horizontal alignment. Well, I can fix that second cell in row 4 because it looks like it just needs to be moved to the bottom trailing edge instead of the leading edge in the center, which is the default. So we can set a grid cell anchor to bottom trailing. The entire third column looks like it needs to align to the right. And I can do that by specifying a grid column alignment on any one of the third cells in the grid rows. Doing so will force that alignment for every cell in the column. So let's just pick one, and we'll assign to the third cell in the second row using the grid column alignment of trailing. Now the horizontal alignment of all of our cells is correct, but we still have some vertical tweaking to do. So let's check out our vertical alignment. Well, we can apply this vertical alignment to an entire row by using the alignment property on the grid row. The second row is aligned to the top, and the third row to the bottom. So let's make those changes now by setting the alignment to top here, and in the next one we'll set the alignment to bottom. If we check our reference image once more, it would appear that we're done. The alignment of the second cell has been set to the bottom trailing already, and the third and fourth cells are set to be centered by default. As you can see, we've got a lot of power to control the placement of views within a grid. In this second example, I want to show you how we can use grids to lay out text in a pleasing way using grids. If you tap on the sample image icon, you'll see what we want to achieve. You can see that we've created an object with a struct called leader. That's an identifiable object with 4 properties in addition to the ID property. And I've got a static array of leader called samples that has information about 4 world leaders and the country they lead. We're going to use that, so let's get started. First, let's just try to set up a 4-column grid and see what we get. We'll start by replacing the comment with our grid container. And next I'm going to use a for each loop on our leader samples array to get an iterator which we can call leader. And now within the for each loop, I can create a grid row that'll display the information in a column or cell. And we'll start with the leader country. Then we'll follow that with the leader's first name, the leader's last name, and then we can use string interpolation to display the population of the country, because it's an int. Now, this isn't very exciting compared to what we see in our example image. In fact, if we add some padding to our grid, like we can do here before the spacer, it really starts to look ugly. There's just not enough horizontal space here on this grid to wrap our numbers properly. So you have to be aware of the width of your view on your device and make sure that your grids will display properly. If we check the sample image, I see that I've decided to move the population down to a second row, and that's below the others, and I've added a header line called population. So let's do that first. First, I'm going to remove this padding. And then I'm going to create a new grid row using that population string as one cell. And then I'll add another text view with the word population as the first cell in the row. Now I don't like the default center alignment, so I'm going to apply a global alignment to the whole grid itself with an alignment of leading. Let's also make that population text view bold. Now our grid or table also needs a header, as you can see. We want the text country and leader across the top. So before, outside our for each loop, we can create another grid row with these 2 views. And we can also apply bold to both text views by applying bold to the grid row itself. Now, this isn't quite what I want. I want the leader view to be centered over the last 2 columns, the first and last names. So, as we did in our previous example, I can set a column span to 2, and nothing changes because the grid has a default alignment of leading for every cell. So we'll need to override this by setting the anchor here for this cell to be centered. I want to join the first and last names, and I can do that by setting the anchor of that first name cell to be trailing. However, I also find that the population is a little difficult to read because it's a leading alignment, and I think that numbers should always have a trailing alignment. But that's also a second column, just as our first name column was. So I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone by setting a grid column alignment of that second column to be trailing. Now, except for the background, this is looking pretty close, but I noticed there is also some separation dividers between each row. And we know how to do that, as we did that in our first example. But remember that all views placed directly inside a grid without a grid row view fill all available space. So we'll also need to set the grid cell unsize axes using the horizontal direction as our set member. And let's do it once more here within the for each loop so that it's going to separate each one of our grid rows. The final piece now is the background. And this can be applied to the entire grid right after the padding. I'll start with a background of a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 10. Next, I'll apply a color of teal. Now that background is right up against our entire grid, so I guess I shouldn't have removed that padding, so let's add that back. So now our background has a nice padding around our grid. It's a bit stark, so let me add the new gradient property introduced in iOS 16 to soften that look up a little. It's still a bit dark in my opinion, so I'm going to add an opacity of 0.8. That looks pretty good. Let's also do one more thing and apply a shadow, and we'll use a drop shadow with a radius of 20. Now it pops out, and if we compare it to our original, it's exactly that I have in my sample diagram. So there you have it. I hope that through this tutorial and these 3 sample grids, you'll have a better understanding of how grids work in iOS 16 and how you can make use of them in your projects to create pleasing presentations of your views. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure that you do give it a thumbs up and leave a comment and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.